This episode of Paradigm Profiles is called Bakersfield, Los Primos Gang Homicide. Pedro Valles was born and raised in Bakersfield, California. He was born to a modest and traditional mother and father who did everything they could to keep food on the table for Valles and his younger siblings. Although Valles' mother and father didn't grow up hanging around some of the local street gangs themselves, Valles had uncles, aunts, and cousins that got involved with the gangs and eventually introduced him to that lifestyle. One of the bigger and more active local street gangs in Bakersfield was a street gang that called itself the Los Primos Gang. This would be the street gang that Valles and several members of his family would later become affiliated with. Bakersfield, the one-time midway or marginal point that separated the Norteño and Sureño alliances, used to be considered ground zero when it came to the separation between these two movements. This also delineated the recruiting grounds for the Mexican Mafia and the Nuestra Familia when these two criminal organizations first evolved within the California prison system. From Bakersfield to the Mexico border was considered to be the Mexican Mafia's recruiting grounds. And from Bakersfield to the Oregon border was considered to be the Nuestra Familia's recruiting grounds. At around age 12, Valles started hanging around with other youngsters who were going down the same path he was. School became a distraction and a hindrance for Valles and some of the other youngsters who he was hanging out with. At one point, the only reason they continued to go is because of the pressure their parents continued to apply, and only because they were told it was a mandatory part of growing up. Any interest that they may have once had in getting good grades and securing an education eventually fell to the wayside. Alcohol became a daily staple, and not before long, smoking marijuana also became part of the daily routine. When Valles first started hanging out with the Los Primos gang, he always felt like he had to prove himself to his friends. He felt like he needed to go above and beyond what young gang members normally do to show their allegiance. This was because he was always considered to be a chubby little kid who didn't get the same type of respect some of his peers did. They looked at him like a little square or a little fat chubby kid who nobody thought could fight. But these frailties or shortcomings only made Valles push that much more harder. Whenever a rival needed to be jumped on, or whenever someone disrespected or challenged the gang, Valles volunteered to be the one to do it. He always tried to be the one to throw the first punch, to be the one who kicked off some of the gang fights that he was in, or to be the most violent of all his little friends. This defective characteristic that he developed would actually progress and would later become one of the factors that would end up getting him sent to California's death row. But as a youngster, he thrived on this. Valles was jumped into Los Primos at the age of 13, and it wasn't long after that Los Primos became the most prominent and the most revered thing in Valles' little young life. At one point, Valles' dad and even one of Valles' uncles tried to save him. They desperately tried to do everything they could to help him once they discovered that he was sinking deeper and deeper into the gang culture. But by then it was too late. Like a lot of other young gang members that get involved with street gangs and that lifestyle, Valles didn't want any help in getting away from the streets, and he pushed back against anyone who tried helping him. Once he was involved, and once the streets had a firm grip on him, he just continued to gravitate and go deeper and deeper into it. Not before long, everything became Los Primos. He walked it, talked it, breathed it, and represented it to the fullest. From the clothes he wore to the tattoos that he would later get, everything in his life was about the Los Primos gang and preserving not only its respect, but its integrity within the gang world. As is the case with most other young gang members who are entrenched within that lifestyle, it wasn't long before Valles started finding himself on the wrong side of the law. As a juvenile, he started out getting into trouble for minor offenses like truancy, stealing beer, and fighting in public. This quickly escalated into more serious offenses like residential burglary, assault, and robbery. After going through the juvenile system and then the adult system as a young adult, Valles began to grasp a better understanding of what it truly meant to be a Sureño. This type of enlightenment and Escalation took place while he was in the county jails and around some of his older homeboys who had already been to prison. Because although Valles understood that he identified with being a Sureño and that he represented the colors of a Sureño, Most young gang members aren't laced up and educated about all that until later, either until they hit the county jail or prison. That's just the reality of it. Nobody really takes the time out to sit you down and school you out there on the streets. Nobody sits you down and explains what the MA is, what the NF is, what the war and the politics are about, what the cause is about, or what it really means to be a sureño or norteño. Most young gang members remain oblivious to this and remain blind to what all this means until later. Like I said earlier, the thing that stood out the most about Valles is this flawed characteristic trait that he developed when he was younger, where he just always felt the need to be more extreme or more flamboyant than everybody else around him. Most of his homeboys from his neighborhood already knew this about him because of the things that they had witnessed him do. But if you didn't know him back then, he just came across like everyone else. After his first stint in prison, his outward appearance changed drastically. To show his allegiance to the Sureños and the Mexican Mafia, Valles had a 6-inch 1-3 emblazoned across his face. And then to show his allegiance to his hood, he had Los Primos tattooed real big across the back of his head in fancy script. After Valles went to prison the first time, he eventually got out and caught another case which resulted in him picking up his second strike. This essentially meant that any other felony that he would have picked up from that point on would have automatically triggered the 3 strikes you're outlaw. Since the 3 strikes law was first enacted on March 7, 2004, when then Governor Pete Wilson signed the 3 strikes bill into law, there's been a number of new revisions and amendments that were stipulated on this law. At first, they were handing it out like hotcakes. Anyone and everyone was getting struck out, and the law was being disproportionately applied to people it wasn't intended for. Created for righteous habitual criminals and the Richard Allen Davises of the world, guys were getting struck out for petty crimes as ridiculous as stealing a slice of pizza or petty theft with a prior. Over the years, it was tamed down, and today it is finally being applied with some level of discretion. But before this, the stringent and harsh penalties that this law imposed created a radical form of desperation for guys who were sitting on 2 strikes and who were potentially faced with their third. In other words, a lot of guys who remained within the criminal element were prepared to either fight to the death opposed to getting arrested or risk going to some type of extreme in order to avoid going back to prison. Others also looked at it like this. They were willing to kill or go all out when risking catching that 3rd strike because they wanted to make it worth it. The mentality was, fuck it, if I'm going to go down on my 3rd strike, I've got nothing to lose. I'm going to make it worth it and take someone out. Or I'm going to make them take me out. This is the radical form of desperation that I'm talking about. This could quite possibly turn what would have been a strong-arm robbery and possession of a deadly weapon into a murder 1 strong-arm robbery and shooting at the police. This was the dilemma that Valles would end up being faced with in 2004. On June 12, 2004, Valles was in Lemoore, California, near a Fast Trip gas station when he was confronted by 2 norteños who asked him about the tattoo on his face. Eddie Cervantes, a 23-year-old from Lemoore, California, was one of the 2 norteños who apparently confronted Valles. Now bear in mind that during Valles' 2010 trial, he did something that most defendants don't normally do and are always advised against. He took the stand in his own defense. This is how the intimate details about this trial were made public. According to Valles, he could tell that Cervantes and his homeboy were getting ready to approach him, based on his own observations and just based on his knowledge of how gang members operate. Valles described the event in detail and said that he watched Cervantes and his homie look at him several times and then engage in small talk. Valles said, "I know the whole song and dance as I've done it many times myself. You're out there pushing through the hood, you spot a knob, and the first thing that happens is you either alert each other or you put each other on notice that there's an enemiga close by." I knew that this was what Cervantes and his homeboy were doing when they spotted me, based on the small talk and all their movements. The way they were looking at me and how they were shifting back and forth between each other. In situations like this, if it's a chance encounter and it's something that happens completely unexpected, you might devise a quick plan of action and discuss how you're going to deal with it. Otherwise, it's just something you let play out, however it's going to play out. Bks obviously wasn't denying his role in this murder and clearly admitted that he was the one that shot and killed Cervantes. However, his purpose for taking the stand was obviously so his lawyers could attempt to humanize him in the eyes of the jury and an attempt to gain sympathy because of his upbringing. All in all, it was to possibly avoid the death penalty, which didn't go over well in the long run. According to Bks' testimony, he pulled out a snub-nosed revolver that he always kept cocked and ready and shot Cervantes once in the chest after Cervantes and his homeboy approached him and jammed him up about the tattoo on his face. He then claimed that he pulled the hammer back on the gun, cocking the trigger again, and then stood over Cervantes, fatally shooting him again in the head. At one point, while Bks was being questioned by the prosecutor asked him why he felt the need to kill Cervantes after Cervantes was already laying on the ground, gasping for air. The prosecutor said, "You say he was gasping for air, that his eyes were open, that he was fighting to live. So why did you feel the need to kill him then?" Either Bks really didn't care about the outcome, or he just had some really bad attorneys, because this is where he definitely buried himself. He responded by saying, "He just had to die. No reason for him to live, right? That's the rule of gangbanging. Never leave nobody alive to come after you later. If I'm going to shoot somebody, I'm not going to let him live." Bks then goes on to describe the radical nothing to lose mentality that motivates guys in the same position that he was in. The mentality that I detailed above. It's possible to assume that if Bks wasn't facing a potential life sentence in prison because of the 3 strikes law, Cervantes might still be alive today. The prosecutor asked him, "Why were you so willing to kill?" Bks says, "I was a 2-striker, you know. If I go in there and just fight with the guy, what, I'm going to be sitting in prison for some 3 strikes? If I'm going to go to prison, I'm going to go to prison for a reason." You would have thought that that's about as bad as it gets when it comes to self-incrimination, but it actually gets worse. There's multiple reasons why it's ill-advised to take the stand in your own defense. For one, you open yourself up to a lot of things that could potentially hurt you. Your entire history, all your past crimes, everything becomes open game, and it gives the prosecutor all the latitude he needs to run a strong smear campaign against you. All the inflammatory, prejudicial evidence that you're normally able to keep out of your trial, had you not testified, is subject to come in and be heard by the jury. And trust me, when this happens, the prosecutors exploit it to the fullest and take extra care of making sure the jury hears all the dirt, all the grimy stuff that strikes fear and terror in the jurors. In Bks' case, however, it did all the above and some. The jury in his trial apparently sat transfixed and in a state of perpetual shock as they listened to the details about how Bks brazenly killed Cervantes and then how he was hoodwinked into discussing details of other murders Bks claimed he was involved in. One in particular murder he spoke about involved a guy who had threatened his little sister and his nephew. Bks described all the illicit details, saying, "I called him up and said, 'Look, I'm going to tell you one time, only one time, I'm coming. I'm going to kill you. Straight out, I'm a man of my word. I found out who I was looking for and I killed him. Shot him in the head, chest, and hand about 5 or 6 times. Just because he laughed at me on the phone like it was a joke." When the prosecutor probed further by asking Bks how many times he had killed, Bks was vague but agreed it might be more than 5, less than 10. One of the jurors later stated that it was almost surreal to hear Mr. Bks describe these killings in such a cold-blooded way. He said Bks felt no remorse and languished at the fact that he had just taken a human life. The courtroom was just dead quiet. He said he felt no remorse and would do it all over again if given the chance. It was the most cold-blooded thing I've ever heard. He said within a matter of a few minutes, he was able to destroy the lives of multiple families. And he talks about it like he's ordering takeout at McDonald's, like everything's just so matter of fact. I obviously wasn't there, so I can only go by what I hear in the media. But I will say this. I've been around a few courtrooms in my life, and I've definitely seen my share of dump truck attorneys. But unless this was somehow part of a convoluted defense strategy, this takes the cake by a long shot. As of today, Pedro Cortez Valles sits on California's death row as condemned inmate number F12726. There's a lot to take away from a story like this, but one of the main things that just keeps coming to mind when I think about Valle and the road he traveled is to never allow yourselves to throw your life away or make radical decisions based on the system of rules and laws that we are all bound to follow. In this capitalistic world that we live in, I could see how this would be an easy thing to do, and I could see how one would become so easily influenced into making drastic choices like Valle did. I lived with the 3 strikes law looming over my head for years. Sitting on 2 strikes kept me walking on eggshells, and it just served as a constant reminder that at any given time, I could catch my 3rd strike. Because of this, it forced me to use a lot more discretion, and there's a lot of things that I didn't do just based on this alone. Something else some of you should learn from this is what could possibly happen to you when you push up on someone just because you feel like jamming them up. I understand that this is just part of the game, that gangs are territorial, and this is what you do when a rival's in your hood. But you never know what someone's got, and all it takes is one mistake for you to run up on the wrong guy, and this could happen to you. In closing, I'm sure you guys have already heard about the new federal indictment that just came down on 28 members and associates of the Mexican Mafia. The charges include racketeering, distribution of narcotics, murders, and a slew of gun charges. It stems from activity that the Mexican Mafia was allegedly involved in on both the streets and in the LA County Jail. Some of the high-profile MA members that were wrapped up in this indictment were Johnny Martinez, who had deep ties to Orange County, Richard Aguirre, and Woody from Compton. The indictment details how the MA had its power distended from Southern California to Calipatria State Prison, where a Mexican Mafia secretary was green-lighted and brutally stabbed. Of those indicted, 21 were already in custody, and many of the others were apparently apprehended. A big portion of the indictment focuses on the new transition of power and the vacuum effect that was created by the passing of legendary mob figure Peter Sano Ojeda. PMN will be releasing something on this in the near future. I hope you guys have enjoyed this episode of Paradigm Profiles. I have another short profile like this one dropping by the end of the week, so be looking out for it. YouTube still isn't showing us any love when it comes to sending out our notifications, so again, check our community page periodically from time to time to see when our content is dropping. Also, we should be implementing our new segment, Calls from Behind the Walls, sometime this week, so be sure to check that out as well. With regards to that, let me just say this. One of the guys you're going to be hearing a lot from goes by the name of Red Rum or Messiah Inc. His stories are fire and his messages will help people. But although he talks a lot about God in his stories, he's not wholly rolling. For him, God was an important part of his struggles, so he talks about it and he explains how his faith helped him get through some of the situations he was in. We could have edited all this out, but we're not about that at PMN. And if we did that, they would no longer be authentic. You guys will see what I'm talking about. But he's just one of many guys in there that you guys are going to be hearing from. On that note, we want to take a minute out to thank all our viewers for supporting us, for continuing to give us your positive feedback, and for helping us prove to all our haters that we're still growing and we're still shining. For a Cinderella channel that's averaging 1,200 new subs a month, we're in a good place right now, and the numbers don't lie. As an acknowledgement to all our viewers and supporters, we want to close by repeating our motto. Our gratitude and appreciation goes out to each and every one of you, our viewers, because without you, we would cease to exist.